Okay.
Okay, let's get started. Hello, everybody, and thanks for coming to the virtual Tuesday talk. My name is Bob Surridge, and I'm the current president of the Historical Society. But probably much more important today, I'm your presenter. Before we begin, I really want to thank the friends of the Harper Library and the staff at the Harper Library, plus the folks from the Old Baldy Foundation for all their help putting these virtual talks together and helping us bring it to the community. And also a big round of applause goes to Liz Fuller, who's has been the pioneer in this effort. I told her if we were a baseball team, she'd be the most valuable player, and that's still true to today. What we're really trying to do is to bring our society members and our friends together, and continue that process of discussing the history of Southport and its surrounding communities. As Liz mentioned, please feel free to turn on your microphone and interrupt me if you have a question or a comment. And thanks again for joining us. Today's talk is going to be about the women of Southport at the turn of the 20th century. The talk itself is really based on the exhibit, which is at the Fort Johnston Visitor Center and Museum. That exhibit has the same name, and the inspiration for the exhibit is the book you see sitting on top of the display cabinet. And that book the title is Hominy Muffins and Oyster Pie, The Lives and Recipes of the Ladies of Southport in 1907. I am the author of that book, and we're using that to go through this presentation about the women of Southport and at the turn of the 20th century. That's kind of hard to get used to. I'm used to saying at the turn of the century, then realizing we're 20 years into the 21st century. Hominy muffins and oyster pie, or hominy muffins as I'll probably end up calling it, is based on a 1907 cookbook that was produced by the St. Philip's Episcopal Church here in Southport. And it's actually not the first book of that type that I've done. The first book that I did that was based on, by coincidence, another 1907 cookbook is what you see on your screen, butter the size of a turkey egg. That book was done by the Kingston, Pennsylvania Presbyterian Church. Kingston is my hometown. The major reason, as you might ask, so why write a book about a cookbook? The major reason is my grandmother. And the picture you see on your left.
And I do not have the book on the screen that you mentioned.
All right. Do others have the book?
Yeah, we do. Do you have a screen that it should have a family and then 2 books on it?
Yeah, I've got it.
You got it, Warren?
Yep.
David, do you have it?
Not yet.
What do you see?
Natalie is trying to get it.
I have it, Liz.
Okay, thank you. What do you see, David?
I see myself on the full screen, and I see 6 little screens, including myself.
Okay, that's okay. Okay, I'm sorry. That's because of the way your setting is. It's kind of hard to explain. I don't want to derail the whole conversation, the whole meeting.
Okay.
Turn your mic off, and you guys
Got
have the settings. Okay, thank you. I'm sorry, Bob, if you could go on.
Okay, so what And I am sorry you're having that difficulty. On the topic, and this slide, the question, why write a book about a cookbook? And really, now that I've written two of them, the answer is, especially for the first one, was my grandmother. And the picture you see on your left, the little girl is my mother, Lois Gay Struble Surridge, and my grandparents next to her, Charles and Beatrice Struble. So why my grandmother? You know, Grandma Struble was my hero. That's the first reason. The second reason is I was her favorite. That plays a lot. It plays into it as well. My grandfather died in the mid 1920s, and my grandmother, at the time he died, had two girls, almost in their teens, and she's my hero. Just what she did in her life, you know, it's not that unusual, but she was a single mother for 60 some years. She outlived my grandfather by almost 60 years. She passed away at the age of 99 in 1983. She raised those girls. She kept her house. She was the caregiver for her mother. Her mother was blind, so that took, you know, even more time and energy and love to do that. She also worked full time, and my mother would say, I'd ask my mother once in a while about things, and I want to ask her about what was it like during the Depression? Were things hard for you? My mother, you know, actually, she said, we as young girls, we really didn't know that there was a depression. So that's how well my grandmother handled things. When I would stay with her, like any young kid, when the telephone rang, I would run and jump and grab the telephone because I know because she got a call every evening from a very good friend of hers. And that friend would say to me on the phone, "Hello, Bobby, is Mrs. Struble there?" And you know, it always took me by surprise. And I said to my grandmother at one time, "Why doesn't your friend call you by your name?" She said, "No one knows your name. You know, no one knows her name is Beatrice." And of course, you know, she was Mrs. Charles R. Struble because that's what she wanted, and that's what the Times called for. So when I found this first church cookbook about my hometown, I started leafing through it, and I was able to notice. First thing I noticed that every woman, now this is in 1907, every woman who contributed to that cookbook, she was her in there as Mrs. Thomas Butler, Mrs. J.R. Vaughan, right? Again, and there were 75 contributors. They all were using their husband's name. And thinking about my grandmother and that practice, I just said to myself, you know, I'm going to find the names. I'm going to look and find the first names of all these women. And kind of and I guess in my mind, it was a tribute. Well, that looking up the names then turned into a book. Then when I came to Southport, I was working at the Adventure Kayak Company, and my friend Emma Thomas said, I showed her the butter the size of the turkey egg, and she said, "Bob, you have to do the same sort of thing for Southport." And that's how hominy muffins and oyster pie came to being, with the help of Millie Hart at the Episcopal Church, who got me a copy of a 1907 cookbook done by St. Philip's. Let me give you a pop quiz though. Does anyone out there can know what butter the size of a turkey egg is referring to? If you do, just turn on your microphone and let us know. Okay, butter the size of a turkey egg was a measurement of how much butter you would put into a recipe. In 1907, it was not the practice to have measuring cups and measuring spoons. So you had things addressed like butter the size of a turkey egg, or you might have butter the size of a walnut. I was just frankly intrigued by that title. So the basis for and the discussion of the women is going to be the women who contributed to a 1907 cookbook developed by St. Philip's Episcopal Church. And for those of you who are out there and seeing there's only one L on my St. Philip's, I was told early on when I was doing this book that back in 1907, that's the way the church addressed spelled the name St. Philip's. Right? What was happening in 1907? There was a small congregation. There was not a pastor serving the church, not even someone coming on a circuit. Things were kind of dire for the St. Philip's. So the ladies of the church, led by Mrs. Dunbar Davis, that's Frances Davis, and Mrs. J.A. Bell, the ladies led by the contributors led by those two people, contributed their recipes, and they produced a cookbook to raise money. This was a tough time financially for folks in Southport, so it was a much needed contribution that the ladies made. The little book itself, some of you may know Mary Lib Bird. Mary gave me or lent me a copy of the little book. It's only 32 pages, has about 100 recipes, breads, soups, meats, vegetables, but interestingly, half of the recipes are desserts and candies, which I really appreciate. 57 ladies contributed to the cookbook. 5 of the ladies had the last name of Newton. 4 of the ladies had the last name of Dozier. 4 of the ladies had the last name of St. George. 33 of the 54 ladies had someone else in their extended family who had also contributed to the cookbook. So it's very much a community effort. And it was also not just the ladies from the Episcopal Church. Ladies from the different churches in town also contributed, which was interesting because as I interviewed people, and I can remember Tommy Harrelson, our friend Tommy Harrelson, and talking to Tommy about one of his great-grandmother who was in the book, and his grandmother also is, and him saying, well, gee, that doesn't make sense because they were staunch Baptists, so it would be unusual. But no, it's not what happened. The people in town pulled together, and you had a good selection, as you'll see, of ladies across a lot of different areas in Southport. Looking at the copy, the title page is what you see. Interesting to me to see that was published at Xmas 1907. Certainly something that would not be on a church cookbook today. I don't believe. I can guarantee you that these ladies were not trying to take Christ out of Christmas or anything of the sort. They knew that X is the first letter of Christ's name in the Greek alphabet, so they knew what they were doing. I also get I'm amused by the little saying, the fish lead a pleasant life, they drink when they like. This is on the last page of their little cookbook. Again, I don't know that that's something today that would be in a church cookbook, but it was in 1907. All right, the way the book is, Hominy Muffins and Oyster Pie, is organized into three parts. History of Southport, in other words, what was Southport, what was it like living in Southport in 1907? That's part one. Part two, I did short bios on 54 of the 57 ladies. Why not the other three? The other three ladies I just could not find information about. Their names were Norma Davis, Mrs. Y.S. Davis, and Lily Williams. So what I did was dedicate the book to those three ladies. Good friends are hard to find and impossible to forget. So we do have bios about 54 of the ladies, and it's from those bios I'll be talking about the ladies. The third part of the book is the recipes. I'll just speak a little bit about the recipes. I am not a cook. I'm a very good eater. So I do appreciate the recipes, but probably for not have the time today to go through them. Okay. So what was Southport like in 1907? Well, first a little bit of the background. Really the beginnings of Southport were the establishment of Fort Johnston, and the attributed date that Fort Johnston was established is 1749. Most historians think that's really just the date that Governor Johnston said it was completed, and there was much more work to be done. Why was Fort Johnston established? Fort Johnston was established to protect the cities upstream on the Cape Fear River, Brunswick Town and Wilmington, to protect those cities from the Spanish at that time. Smithville then is established by Joshua Potts and others in December 31st, 1792. The community was established by the North Carolina legislature. And then in 1887, the name was changed from Smithville to Southport. It was named Smithville after Governor Benjamin Smith. The map on the right is a replica of an early map of Smithville, showing the locations and the sizes of the first 100 lots. Those lots sold in a lottery for, at the time, for $4. I guess I missed another deal. Okay. Southport's population in 1890 to 1920, you can see there, increased by 39%. That's a big increase for a community to handle. And in fact, the county increase, Brunswick County increase, was about the same, actually just a little bit more. And interestingly, the increase in the country's population was even greater, or a greater percentage. That was due to the especially in the northeast, to the incoming new immigrants who came into the country. This was the period in one decade, 9 million, quote, new immigrants came into the United States. These were the folks from Southern and Eastern Europe. So there were Russians, Slovaks, Italian. They were mostly Catholic or a lot of Jewish immigration at that time. So this was a booming town booming time, excuse me, for immigration into the country, and for Southport a sizable influx of new residents. May not have been those immigrants that were coming to the coal mines in northeastern Pennsylvania, but there was still a great influx of folks coming into the community. A little bit of the background of how we get to 1907 is some of the things happened earlier that we have to be aware of, and I'm going to start that with the end of the Civil War, 1864, 1865. Wilmington was arguably the most important city in the South. Why? Because Wilmington, North Carolina, and Galveston, Texas, were really the only port cities that blockade runners, and these are ships coming in, running past the Union blockade, but anyway, that blockade runners could accomplish their mission of coming in and getting to Wilmington. Even in those days, they were maybe 80% successful in coming in. Why? Every other port, Charleston, Norfolk, every other port along the Atlantic coast and the Gulf Coast was shut off except for Wilmington and Galveston. The problem with Galveston is the goods could come into Galveston, Texas, but then they could not get the goods across half a continent to the eastern states, to Virginia and the Carolinas, and those that were fighting the war for the Confederacy. Why were they successful in Wilmington? And the map on your left is tells that bit of that story. On the map, you'll see, if I can help with my cursor here, you see New Inlet here up by Fort Fisher, and then down here, what they called Old Inlet. And Old Inlet is the inlet we know today between Oak Island and Bald Head Island. So that was Old Inlet. New Inlet up by Fort Fisher was an inlet that was created by a hurricane in the 1760s. So having two options of how to get the blockade runners into Wilmington was very, very advantageous for the Confederacy. The other thing that made it difficult for the Union to handle these two inlets was for them to move a ship from, say, New Inlet to Old Inlet. They would come down south on the Atlantic, but then they would run into Frying Pan Shoals, which you all know goes from the tip of Bald Head Island out 28 miles into the Atlantic. So a simple trip that if they were on the river would have been about 7 miles became a 60-mile, almost a 60-mile trip. It's those factors that made it very, very difficult. The picture on your right is a display we have at the Fort Johnston Museum, and display is talking about one of those blockade runners, a man by the name of Christopher Columbus Morse, or as he went by, C.C. Morse. Morse was a river pilot. A river pilot, of course, you know, the pilot is the one who brings the ship in over the bar and then navigates the ship up 28 miles on the Cape Fear River. So a very critical part of the blockade runner's crew. Morse ran the blockade 33 times, and he was successful 33 times. This little display we have tells that story. Some of the more of the interesting artifacts we have there. We have down at the bottom shelf, it's difficult to see in the picture, but over in the left-hand corner is a large leather family Bible that he purchased in 1863 in London, and we know that because he has it dated and signed. There's also his, on the bottom shelf, really difficult to see in a picture, I apologize, is his sword and his spyglass are both there. On the upper shelf is James Sprunt's book about the Cape Fear area. And then on the right is an interesting artifact. It's an octant. And an octant was used in the early 1800s as a navigational device. In Southport, there were, in the Southport area, probably 77 men who were river pilots, and most of them ran the blockade. Only 5 of those men died during the war. 4 of them from yellow fever, and one was actually, it appears that he was killed by his own men before the Union blockaders took over the ship. The other one we hear about the most is Tommy Thompson. Tommy Thompson was very successful. He ran the blockade some 81, 82, 83 times, not exactly sure the number, and was successful 77 on 77 of those attempts. So that's kind of your introduction to New Inlet, and that New Inlet is going to be important as we go on. What this picture, this way it was column, is showing you is called the Rocks. And the Rocks is a dam that goes essentially from what they called as Federal Point, the peninsula that Fort Fisher is on, to Zeke's Island, and then from Zeke's Island to Smith Island, or now Bald Head Island. So it is a dam that cuts off New Inlet, and it was built and finished in 1781 after the Civil War. Now, why did they close New Inlet? Now, navigationally, the answer is fairly straightforward. That inlet was bringing silt and sand in from the Atlantic that was clogging up the natural channel within the Cape Fear River. And they knew this, they had known this for a while. The war kind of slowed down their building of a dam, well, stopped their building of a dam, but they finally got this dam in place, and that silt that stopped from coming in And what that did was recreate Southport or Smithville's deep natural harbor. So the closing of that inlet allowed the river to restore itself, and the river's currents helped to cut out that shipping channel, excuse me. So that Southport has this beautiful, large, landlocked, deep harbor. Right? And if you look at the map, it's, you know, imagine that harbor, well, not imagine, it's there, that harbor that goes from the tip of Bald Head Island, cross it over to Southport, and that's about three miles of that distance, and then going up from Fort Caswell to Fort Fisher to the north extends that harbor about 7 miles up the river. That's huge. And what it actually is, and we'll learn out why in a minute, it is the largest harbor between Panama and Norfolk, Virginia. So this tremendous resource was coming or came back to Southport. Right? And that opportunity gave, I said, the port of the South, because when the name was changed from Smithville to Southport, that was the reason to indicate that Southport was to be the port of the South. Well, the community had railroad fever because the port was not that useful to them unless they had a railroad serving the community and serving the port. So in the 1880s, railroad fever came alive in Southport, and new immigrants coming from the Midwest, coming from the northeast, folks looking to take advantage of this opportunity. So in 1887, when the name was changed from Smithville to Southport, it was done to enhance. It was a chamber of commerce type of move to sell the city. But in 1887, right after it was changed, the Northern and Southern Railroad rented office space in Southport. And then you can see the next bullet. Southport's most enthusiastic boomers feel sure that Southport will someday practically wipe Wilmington off the map. That came from as you can see, the Southern Times Tourist. Not everybody was that enthusiastic, and you can see that in the last bullet in that saying that Smithville is now suffering under the name of Southport, an affliction forced upon it by some enterprising spirits from the northwest. And you can see the date on that. All right, so this opportunity did attract investors, and let me tell you about one of them in particular. One is Enoch Bunker Stevens. E.B. Stevens was a member of the Chicago Board of Trade. In 1889, he brought his family, he had adult sons, his family, and a young daughter by the name, and her name was Jessie. So Jessie Stevens. He brought them to Southport. Mrs. Stevens, Catherine, was an Irish immigrant and one of those who contributed to the books, as well that her daughter also contributed. They came with the idea, or he came with the idea of working to bring that railroad in to serve Smithville. And the idea was a railroad would bring grain from the west, and which is actually the Midwest, coal from Tennessee, and then on a return trip, take the goods from the brought in from across the world into the interior of the United States. You notice that E.B. Stevens was from Chicago in 1907 or 1800s. That was really considered to be the Northwest, and one could suspect it's E.B. Stevens and others from Chicago that the president of the North Carolina Literacy and Historical Society is referring to in that last quote on the left hand side, on the last quote on the slide. Right, so we had a railroad starting in 1887. Unfortunately, what happens is the financial panic of 1893 hit the United States, and speculative railroad projects all over the country were stopped. So this opportunity seems to be fading away. Money was lost in Southport, but some of the men, like E.B. Stevens, stayed in Southport, and he built a very strong real estate and insurance companies. Plus E.B. Stevens's family, and there is a family of service, is truly his legacy. You'll learn about, if you already know, Jessie Stevens Taylor, who was one of the ladies contributed to the book, was his daughter. Jessie Taylor's daughter was Margaret Harper. Margaret Harper and her husband ran the Stateport Pilot newspaper, and she also ran her grandfather's insurance and real estate companies, and she became the president of the American Insurance Association. I'm not sure that's quite the name, and she was also the first woman in North Carolina to run for statewide office. More to come. In the early 1900s, the railroad fever comes back, and it comes back because there's anticipation of the United States took over construction of the Panama Canal in 1904. So there's anticipation that the Panama Canal is going to open up soon, and ships will be coming by the number up the East Coast from the Panama Canal. I remember I said that Southport now has the largest natural, deep, wide, big harbor, the largest harbor between the Panama Canal and Norfolk. So that, again, they see this as a tremendous opportunity. And indeed, in 1911, the Wilmington, Brunswick, and Southern Railroad comes to town. Unfortunately, folks, for the Southportians of that day, the WBNS, the Wilmington, Brunswick, and Southern Railroad, the WBNS was really too little and too late. One of the major parts of the plan was that we would become a coaling stop. And actually there were coaling decks that were built in Southport. But ships, steamers at that time were in the process of changing from coal to oil. So that opportunity was lost. And the railroad itself, the WBNS, which also stands for willing but slow, or will bump and shake, really wasn't much of a railroad. The equipment, second-hand maybe, and also some of it third-hand. So it has a grand opening on November 23rd, 1911. It doesn't start really operations until a couple years later. And then passenger operations grow from about 1913 to 1933. Passenger operations are stopped in 1933. And then in 1938, the freight system is also stopped. Passenger service was replaced, and the freight to some degree by trucking and bus and trucking. So that's what they're, the big dream is gone, slowly going away. But Southport in 1907, in the early 1900s, is really in pretty good shape. It's really good shape. The enthusiasm from the dream of the railroad made many things happen. Some of you think of simple things, the paving of streets with oyster shells. The first street lamp in Southport was put on Moore Street. So things, there were cleanup days, there were different activities that the Chamber of Commerce-like organizations and the newly founded Southport Women's Club put into action. And I think Liz will be speaking about those next week, about some of that next week, I believe. But you can see, you got a town of 1,500 people. It's much different here have a town on the coast than a town that's in the center of the county. Here you had tourism, 4 hotels. You can just read it: 4 hotels and 2 saloons, 3 lawyers and 3 real estate agents. Probably gave each other a lot of work. And you can see the number of retail stores where 2 physicians in a small rural town. Why did that happen? Well, primarily because there was a quarantine station here. But you can see just by in this little list what's happening. Also, the fish factories. This was really the heyday of the Menhaden fishing industry, and there were several fish factories in the Southport area. And they were doing well and providing work for the community, which brought out the sayings, the smell of Southport money. The activities. This photograph has to be later than the early 1900s or 1910s, probably into the 1920s. But anyway, we know it's later because in the 1910 period, there was a town ordinance passed that swimsuits had to cover down below the knees, both male and female, down below the knees and down to the wrists during the day, during daylight hours. So you can see this daylight, and these swimsuits are a little more modern than that. But a lot of activities in Southport, the recreational activities, swimming, a lot of hunting and fishing. In fact, one of the favorite hunting days was Thanksgiving Day. House parties, just like we have house parties today. Interestingly, though, that some of these house parties went 2 or 3 days, and some even went as long as a week. Picnics and baseball games. Southport had its own baseball team. We played the towns in the area, as well as the soldiers at Fort Caswell, and that was a big event. Music was really important. And then swamp gardening. The swamp garden was used by folks in the Southport community, and its location is really behind where the Smithville Burying Ground is. It was land that had been drained from Bonnet's Creek that is there. And then, of course, Southport's iconic holiday celebrations, and especially the 4th 4th of July. Now, that's kind of a, that's a description of what life and the energy that Southport had and the things that were going on. Now, the ladies of Southport, how, what did they do? What did they contribute? As I said, 54, I have biographies of 54 of the 57 ladies. Of the 54 ladies, all of them are from North Carolina at the time. They were living in North, only 2, I guess I should be saying all of them were native born in the United States, except for 2 immigrants, Catherine, E.B. Stevens' wife, Catherine, and Agnes Cravens. They were both Irish immigrant. Of the 54 ladies contributing to the cookbook, the oldest person was 82 years old, and the oldest lady was 82, and the youngest lady was 11 years old. Their average date at death was 72 years, and that's quite astounding since the life expectancy of women in that time period was about 50 years. The youngest death was a young lady. She died at the age of 22 in 1914. And the oldest death was Catherine Price, I believe, and she died at the age of 99. There's a lifespan from the date that the oldest person was born in 1825 to 1988 of 106 years. So this group of women had a 163-year lifespan. Okay, I got a pop quiz for you. Let's see how we do on this one. I hope you do well on the pop quiz, because it's going to be the major part of your grade, as we're not going to have a final exam. And Liz talked me out of assigning each one a paper to do. So here you go with the pop quiz. Looking at the display on your right-hand side, on the top shelf, you can see onto the right, the little brown object, that's a bellows that was used at the Stewart house, and that was a gift to the society from Brooks Newton Priok. Looking to the left of that, you see looks like a little pot, and the top of the pot lying next to it. Anybody know what that little pot was used for? Please unmute yourself and tell us. Okay, it is, and there must have been a lot of these. The society has 2 that have been donated to us. It is an turtle egg Duff baking pan, I'll call it. Turtle egg Duff is similar to a consistency of a cake, and you use this pan to make the Duff. Right? This was, of course, at a time when it was not illegal to collect turtle eggs. And actually, in the turn of the century and throughout Southport's early history, turtle eggs were a very desired food stuff. And actually, kids would make enough money to buy school clothes by gathering and selling turtle eggs for 15 cents a piece in the early time. So that's a turtle egg Duff. All right, I broke the ladies into 3 groups. The first group is Carolina ladies, and I want to talk first about Susan Lachlan, Mrs. J.J. Lachlan, and that's her family on the left-hand side. Her daughter Norma, her sons, her husband, JJ, and on the bottom row is Gertrude Lachlan, and then Susan's mother, Mrs. Tunstall, Lucy Agnes Tunstall. Just a quick note, Gertrude Lachlan, the little girl there, was the first person to take a book out of the newly established library. And I think it was established in 1909, but she was the first person to take a book out of that library. And the book's title was Rebecca of Sunnybrook Farm. Now, Susan and the family, that picture there is taken in front of their home in, on Lord Street. Prior to when this picture was taken, we have evidence from the 1910 census that the Lachlan family was living in the old Brunswick County Jail that is on Nash Street, corner of Nash and Rhett Street in Southport, and it is the Southport Historical Society's old jail museum. So they were living in that old jail, and according again to the census, we can also tell from the census that they were living, it must have been on the first floor because there were prisoners on the second floor. And of course there's a prison cells on the second floor. So that would make sense. If you've been through the old jail, you have some idea of the space that is available, and it's a bit hard to imagine. One of the theories is why they were there is that JJ took any job he could get and tried to do anything that he could to provide for his family. So he may have taken the job as the jailer, and then Susan would be his wife would be the cook. They took it probably while the house that you see behind them was being built. So it's just a stop, if you will, for them. Susan was a milliner. Her husband was a jailer, a grocer, a land developer. He was at the end of his life, or part of his life, he was an administrator at the Dozier Hotel. I hope I don't have him mixed up with the son. One of the things he tried to do was establish a town between here and Wilmington by the name of Lachlan. That's all I've ever heard about it, so I'm just presuming that didn't work out so well. Susan, you can see the life that she was living was very, as she looks in the photographs, to me, very, very capable and kind of a go-getter herself as a milliner. Second woman on the list is Mrs. E.H. Charlotte Atkins. Miss Lottie, as she was known, was Robert Rurick's maternal grandmother. And Robert Rurick, rather famous North Carolinian author and columnist, Robert Rurick was her grandson. Each summer, Robert Rurick would come and live with Captain Adkins and Miss Lottie. And in fact, Rurick wrote a book about his experiences with his grandparents. The book's titled The Old Man and the Boy. And it's really a fantastic book. It talks a lot about his activities with his grandfather and about fishing and hunting and so on, but it's not really about that. It's really about the interaction between the two generations and the love and respect between the generations. He talks also a lot about Miss Lottie in the book, and some of some of the things that she would say, he recounts. One of them was, she told him one time, she told Captain Atkins and Robert Rourke that if they wanted to eat, they better go out and go hunting, because meat was 10 cents a pound, and she was not about to spend 10 cents a pound for meat. So you want meat, you better go out and shoot something. I think at the time she was actually talking about turkey at Thanksgiving time. This little sidebar here. He also mentions, Ruick mentions the fruitcakes that she made. And just one thing about the recipes in the book, there are at least a half a dozen recipes in that book for fruitcakes. And you know, there's not a lot of us anymore that like fruitcake. And we say, well, why was that? Well, think about it. The fruits and nuts that went into those cakes and then were preserved or kept over and into the winter months, were maybe they were the sweet that you had. So I could see it could be very, very popular. Third woman. Yes, ma'am.
Sorry to interrupt you. I just wanted to mention, so we're at the end of the hour. So if people need to leave, then they can go ahead and log off if they have to. That we'll have the recording later, because there's lots of good information still to come. But I know we had told people to schedule an hour. So I just wanted to let people know if they needed to go, they could, and then we'll just keep going. Okay?
Okay. All right, let me jump down to Miss Kate Stewart, and I apologize for being wordy. Miss Kate Stewart was the owner of the Stewart House, and that's the Stewart House that's in the picture below. If you want to look at people in Southport's history, Miss Kate was one that you surely want to look at. She was known over time as the heroine of Smithville. That's because she saved the life of a little girl who fell into the river. Miss Kate went into the river in her full dress and pulled the young girl out. She was an educator. She had the Southport Academy in the early days. She was a patron of the arts, a businesswoman, and I also believe a bit of a politician. Called the Grand Old Lady of North Carolina. She stopped. The state wanted to move the county seat from Smithville at that time to actually where it is now in Bolivia, and this was in the late 1880s. She had the political oomph, if you will, to stop that in its tracks. And her attorney, John Bellamy from Wilmington, writes in his memoirs that the sole reason it was stopped in 1884 or so was Miss Kate Stewart. Quite a contributor to Southport's history. Guests at the Stewart House Inn included notables such as Woodrow Wilson and Robert E. Lee, and had guests from all the states in the Union at that time. Right. Newcomers, ladies who came new to Southport. Let me focus on the two, Margaret Curtis and Jessie Stevens Taylor, who lived in Southport for long periods of time. Miss Jessie Stevens is the daughter of E.B. Stevens I spoke about. And that picture is of her. She later married C. Edward Taylor, so she's Miss Jessie Stevens Taylor, and she was the weather flag lady for some 60 years. Beyond that, she was the push behind the establishment of the Southport Civics Club, which became the Southport Women's Club. And I believe in her own right, she was a very young woman when she did that. She was also a bit of a politician because she got Miss Kate Stewart to take the presidency of the Civic / Women's Club. And who was ever going to say no to Miss Kate? So again, that would be a person you want to look into in Southport history. Mrs. Walter G. Margaret Curtis. She was the wife of Dr. Curtis, who was the long-term quarantine station physician. She was she was about 35, and he was in his 50s when they married. He had lost 2 lives before that, who died as young women. Margaret Curtis is really a bit of an enigma. She left her diary, a diary she kept from 1885 roughly to 1895. The diary is primarily about her 3 young boys, and she dotes over those boys. However, she also puts in that diary her disappointment, her deep disappointment with living in Southport. At one point, she wrote her mother saying she loved her husband dearly, but she hated this place. And there was no one in town, I believe, I'm going to limb here, no one in town that wanted that railroad to come more than Margaret Curtis. And that's because the railroad had told her and her husband that they would buy the Curtis properties, which included what is now the Brunswick Inn on Bay Street, that they would buy the Curtis properties for $25,000, a princely sum in 1907. And with that money, Mrs. Curtis planned, and her husband planned, to move to another location. That diary is available on the Susie Carson online research room, and it's fascinating room. One of the things that she was really unhappy about was the Episcopal Church, that it didn't have a pastor, and she was worried about her sons and wanting that church experience for them. Notice the division between Carolina ladies and newcomers. The next group are the young ladies who contributed recipes. Bessie Newton is the young lady I spoke about before. She died in 1988, so she was the last contributor of the cookbook to pass away. Lillian Dozier, I don't know if any of you would have known our friend Lou Hardy. Lillian Dozier was his aunt. I interviewed Lou about her, and he said Aunt Bitsy is what they called her, and she was quite a character. He said she would often say, "I'll tell you my age, but I'll never tell you my weight." And ironically and unfortunately, she died of a heart attack, and Lou was the one who found her, waiting for her sister to come with her new Cadillac so they could go riding around town. Almeda Stanland was 14 years old when she cleared the book. She passed away at 22 years of age. Interesting, her daughter was born the same year that Almeda passed away, her daughter Gwendolyn. So Gwendolyn never knew her mother, but when Gwendolyn's daughter was born in 1939, she named her after her mother, Almeda. Almeda Crow would have been Almeda Stanland's granddaughter. Almeda Crow was well known in this community. So that's a brief on the ladies. What does this group of individuals coming together to make a cookbook for a church that was in financial problems, what does it show? I mean, what it shows is the characteristics of a healthy, forward-thinking community. Different parts of that community, the friends, the relatives, the young and the old, the native North Carolinians, the newcomers, coming together to advance the community. St. Philip's was an important institution, and it was in danger, and the community came together and helped it survive. Okay? These are some of the things you'll find with the recipes: cook until done, butter the size of a walnut, and my sister Jean's favorite, roll the dough for 1 hour. And then and there's lard in everything. So lardy, 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 we need more lard. Some of the contributors you'll know, I'm sure some of you will know some of those names. Quick story about Kathy St. George Johnston. She is the family historian for the Johnstone extended family, and she said to me one day, "Bob, I do all this history and all this looking at ancestors and stuff. Bob, I really think I might be related to myself." I wish I could hear you laugh, because that is funny. Next, just a little commercial I have for you here, and that's we appreciate you all coming, whether you're members or friends. We'd like to have you as part of our membership. And if you go on our website, the address is at the bottom, and go to our store, you can purchase a membership. An individual membership is just $15. And if you want to add a student that you know to that, that's just an extra $2 for that student's annual membership. Okay? So you may want to, hope you'll take a look at that. Let me also say the book Hominy Muffins and Oyster Pie is currently for sale on the Society's webpage. Again, you go to the web store, and you'll be able to find the book Hominy Muffins and Oyster Pie. Hope you'll keep on discovering Southport history, and thank you for coming along today. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.